Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Leading Through a Pandemic. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, a professor here at LBS, and I'm your host for this entire series, looking at some of the bigger picture perspectives on the challenges we're all facing in these tough times. Today is the 10th webinar in our series, which started some 5 weeks ago at the beginning of the lockdown period. Our topic today is led by Professor Rajesh Chandy, a professor of marketing and also the director of our Wheeler Centre at the London Business School. So welcome, Rajesh. He's going to talk to us about marketing leadership in a time of crisis. Welcome.
Thank you, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here.
So without further ado, Rajesh, let me give the floor to you and you can tell us a little bit about marketing leadership in a time of crisis.
Wonderful. Thank you again. It's a delight to be here. It feels like, at least from some of the people who reached out to me, that it's one of the many reunions I've had in the last few weeks. I hope you're all staying safe, and thank you for joining us. Let me start by acknowledging the reality that we're experiencing today. So many of us are thankful for and grateful to those who are out in the front lines. This episode, this cartoon of our troops reporting to the front line really resonates, in part because my wife Larissa right now is at the Royal Free Hospital as a doctor on the COVID ward, and every time she leaves home, I feel like that little guy up there saying, "Come home safe, Larissa. I hope you are." While we recognize all of the folks on the front lines on the medical front, of course, it is also important to recognize, as some have, the heroes, the unexpected heroes that we're discovering who've lived within our midst, those who deliver our kebabs, and those who give us our groceries and check out things and help us despite the many risks to them. Officially, they're now apparently part of the superheroes club. I will also note, Julian, I want to say thank you to you because you, in your role as Dean of degree programs at London Business School before, and now as Dean of Executive Programs, have been really a key catalyst for the changes that we as an organization, London Business School, has gone through and has helped us prepare to the extent we can and have for this pandemic. And especially you not forced us necessarily, gently persuaded us to change the curriculum even before many of the things we're talking about became real, as well as the formats in which we teach. I'm almost expecting a course like this to appear in our catalog, Julian. We pride ourselves on being a business school that keeps its curriculum up with the times. And asking for bailouts 101 is one of the more popular electives, it appears. Now, to the extent that there have been some grave news and some silver linings, this graph, which is on the grave side, represents it. So we've all seen these graphs. This is the linear scale, and how dramatically the pandemic has come among us. Of course, we've seen these graphs before. That's Al Gore. You may remember from the movie, among other places, about climate change, of global warming, pointing out exactly this graph, the exponential function. And the mathematician Albert Bartlett points out that the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. So here's President Trump on March the 6th in the United States saying, "It's an unforeseen problem." What a problem! Came out of nowhere. Of course, we were just at the cusp of that inflection in the exponential curve. The philosopher William Gibson points out that one way to ensure that this is not an unexpected problem and came out of nowhere is to look beyond our own narrow context. It is to look across contexts. In order to fathom and understand the future, we have to look at the present that others are experiencing. And in his wonderful words, the future is already here, it is just unevenly distributed. And if we look at the experience of China and Italy and various other countries, we know that in some ways, unless we act, and that is an important consideration we'll come to later on, unless we act, our future may be that of our brethren who did not have the benefit of learning from others. I'll also note as a setup that big problems such as these, such as what we're experiencing today, represent big opportunities. Not only commercial opportunities, but opportunities to make a difference. In the words of Vinod Khosla, the Silicon Valley investor, any big problem is a big opportunity. If there's no problem, there is no solution and no reason for a company to exist. No one will pay you to solve a problem that does not exist. So if nothing else, we have an abundance of problems, some of which are medical, but as we will note later, we're only starting to grasp some of the other problems we're facing. But the good news is those of you who are innovators, who are entrepreneurs, who want to create change, perhaps there's not been a better moment than today to create change. Speaking of change, this is an image of spending by American consumers for the week in April, ending April 1st, so a couple of weeks ago, relative to the pre-COVID period. And what you see is something you may have contributed to. Lots and lots of online grocery deliveries, no movie theaters or airlines or cruises or gyms or new clothes. Apparently, I don't know if pajamas are counted separately. Charitable giving, interestingly, has gone down, and dramatic changes relative to the status quo as we look. Interestingly enough, intimate apparel has gone down substantially. Let's not get into perhaps the reasons why. If there's good news, though, we know that the exponential function that we see at the start here is not one that will continue to head up to the heavens. We know from many sources, from experience and our own history as well as that of others, that this too shall pass. The CDC in the United States has elaborate plans on what to do, but I'm curious about your perspective. And the perspective, your perspective from the perspective of your company, as to whether you see this customer behavior as being likely to be different after the pandemic is over. So Sada, could we have the first poll, please? So from the perspective of your company, is customer behavior likely to be substantially different after the pandemic is over? Is it likely to be very different? Is it likely to be somewhat different or about the same? Let's give it a second or two. Sada, let's see the results, please. Okay. Some 23%, close to a quarter feel it'll be very different. A majority substantially believe it'll be somewhat different. Of course, it'll be interesting to learn what that somewhat will be. Perhaps we'll explore some of that. And partly some of you might be hedging your bets because frankly, we really don't know what the future, at least in the short term, will involve. And that has implications for the long term because we don't know. In fact, Julian and Sada and I were just discussing before, when will we be able to get out of this, of our homes? Who knows? And maybe if we go out, will things start all over again? And so on. I will not address that question today. I will note, however, that it is hard to pick up a newspaper these days without reading about COVID. You all no doubt experienced it, and here I am contributing to the problem. It is striking that almost 70% of all newspaper articles during this last month or so 70% in the United States, probably elsewhere too, involve the word COVID. Now, and yet, despite this ocean of information, there's not a drop of certainty. How bad will it be? How long will it be? We still don't know. We do know, however, that this too shall pass. And this is probably a good time, if you already read the books, to go back to Jared Diamond's wonderful books, Guns, Germs, somewhat relevant these days, and Steel, and Collapse, which sounds rather ominous, and it is. It's really worth reading. But a point we will touch on in the time we have left will be how societies and companies, in our case, and we as individuals, choose to fail or survive. A friend of mine, Mario, who might be on at the moment, sent me this. I'm not a subscriber to the Robb Report, which is apparently a luxury magazine. Apparently, we do know from the experience of China, as of a couple of days ago, Hermes is doing well already. I don't know if that bodes well for, well, let me not go there, for humanity. Now, many of you are experiencing as we speak and implementing and are in the process of executing the absolutely necessary short-term actions. And of course, both companies, managers, as well as customers engage in what's called a flight to safety. And as a business executive, as many of you are, a paramount objective is to ensure that our colleagues are safe, okay, to the extent we can help. It is also terribly important to make sure our key customers continue to see us as fulfilling their needs to the extent, again, we can. And to ensure that we'll be alive once this passes, and conserving cash as much as possible. These are absolutely crucial tasks, and these are painful tasks very often with very important trade-offs. These are not tasks I will talk about today. Perhaps in Q&A, if we have time, we can get into it. I will note that many of you are rummaging through your attics, things you may have done, capabilities you may have built in the past that might be relevant to the days of to our days today. And as we head out, perhaps you will find some Rembrandt in the attic, ones that people will value, especially as this moment has arisen. Again, this is not something we will talk about today. And we will not do too many more, to an extent, prognostications of why we fail to prepare for disasters. Also a terribly important question. I recommend the article today in the Financial Times. Instead, we will focus, even this, in a period where the future seems very hard to predict, and where it seems beyond the power of any one individual, let alone company or government, to influence it in any meaningful way. We will talk about the ways in which we can today help shape the future. And I'll talk about three dimensions: what we can expect on markets, what we can expect on firms, or can do as firms, and can do as individuals. Yeah. And the logic would be, again, that the world we emerge into will be somewhat different for reasons we'll examine. And what should marketing leaders do? And to do that, I want to step away from the world of COVID. I want to step away from the world of businesses and point to lessons from the fruit fly. 6 Nobel Prizes have been given for research involving the fruit fly. Many of us are beneficiaries of this research. The business equivalent of fruit flies are restaurants. Why? Because much like fruit flies, restaurants tend sadly, to die quickly. The lives of restaurants are notoriously short. This means, much as with scientists studying fruit flies, we can examine the evolution, the mutations that exist within restaurants or fruit flies, and how evolution occurs in this context within a shorter period of time than we can more broadly when evolution takes a long time. And there has been some research on the evolution of restaurants, and we know because just as they're suffering today, restaurants die quickly for many reasons, including the fact that they often tend to be mom and pop shops. They tend to be poorly capitalized, and this is an intensely competitive business. What does this imply? The sad reality is we can expect that many of our favorite restaurants, and hopefully more of the lesser favorite restaurants, not that one would wish anything bad to anybody, especially not restaurants, will disappear by the time we come out. Now, it may be that much like Hermes, the fine dining places might come back. Regardless, things will change in the restaurant. But nevertheless, those of you who live in London know, nevertheless, the restaurant industry overall will evolve and change. Why? Because the new entrants to the restaurants business will come with new ideas. They will have, in the evolutionary terms, mutations that perhaps will allow them better odds of success as times have changed. Yeah? So this will mean that although some businesses will die, despite the best efforts of government and so on, that is already happening. The changes that will come, because people will go out and eat, some of you pointed out, they may not be very different, but the changes that will come from the new generation of restaurants will imply that the restaurant industry overall will change. And these changes are particularly likely these days because of the forces, the winds of change that are blowing today. And these include technological forces, social and cultural forces, economic forces, regulatory, and natural forces. Let me explain, and let's go beyond the restaurant industry. We are celebrating the supermarket cashier heroes who serve us in this very moment. It turns out the supermarket checkout job was, if not the worst, among the worst in terms of number of jobs lost in the recent period. 25.3% of jobs have disappeared in the United Kingdom alone in the supermarket checkout business between 2011 and 2017. And this process may only get stronger. More generally, the trends towards robotics and perhaps globalization and work and how we work, and not necessarily having to travel as we're doing now, might imply dramatic changes in how societies function. And this is a whole other conversation I won't get into. The trends toward artificial intelligence that, for example, Sundar Pichai had pointed to a couple of years ago will only get stronger. Social and cultural trends will get stronger. And perhaps we'll see finally a change. So here's one of insurance in countries that don't have public health systems. Yes, he has no healthcare down there, but it doesn't affect us, says the couple with the Cadillac insurance. But of course it does. And global warming and its impact, all of these may well change. And the smart leaders, the smart marketers of the world are those that will be able to better detect these changes. And I'll come to that in a second, and harness these winds of change. Already, if we look to the future, to the extent that we could use the stock market as a window to the future and expectations of the stock market, with all of the caveats we are aware of, as a window to the future, we know that certain industries are getting hammered more than others. So healthcare and technology are doing better, relatively speaking, than energy and financial services. But even within healthcare and technology, some are benefiting and others are not. And the question is, why does that happen? And how can our companies or our organization both benefit and make a difference? And this, of course, will require innovation. So here's my second poll question. Compared to the pre-crisis period, how open is your company to implementing the new ideas for growth? Sada, could you please pull that up? Thank you. So compared to the pre-crisis period, how open is your company to implementing new ideas for growth? Is it less open, about the same, or more open? All right, let's stop the survey. What do we see? More open. That's very promising. That gives me hope. Only 7% say less open. Now, of course, the question is, what kinds of new ideas? Ideas for now or ideas for the future? Because the future certainly is hazy. And in order to better understand the future and sort of help frame our thinking and end with a few takeaways, what I want to switch our topic to again is, not COVID, but a different way of dying. Okay, we much as with COVID, low probability historically, and hopefully will remain low probability. Which of these is a more frequent cause of death? I won't ask you this question. I will just mention this. It's a classic study done with a whole bunch of people. Which of these is a more frequent cause of death? Shark attacks or falling airplane parts? And of course, you know that most people say shark attacks, when in fact, falling airplane parts are 30 times higher as more likely as a cause of death. And in fact, many other things could kill you, are more likely to kill you than shark attacks. Hippos, for instance, ants even. And speaking of things that we don't have to worry about in the immediate future, at least, not only shark attacks, not only do we not have to worry about airplanes, we don't even have to worry about beach vacations, because sand, it turns out, is more deadly than shark attacks. And yet, we tend to believe somehow that shark attacks are more common. Why is that? Partly, it is because the information environment that surrounds us is filled with information about sharks. Even often when the topic has nothing to do with sharks. You don't even have to show a shark. And the psychology is something called the availability heuristic. We judge the likelihood of events based on the ease with which they can be recalled. So if I say shark attacks or falling airplane parts, you can imagine shark attacks. With airplane parts, you're still trying to figure out airplane parts. Where do they come from? Who? What? It takes a few seconds longer or milliseconds longer for us to imagine that. It's less salient. Shark attacks are also more vivid. This means that we can imagine it much more clearly. The same applies in the context of markets, and especially as we think about markets in the context of a crisis such as this. The information environment around us is all about COVID. And of course, there will be a post-COVID world. It'll be affected by it, perhaps. Some of you pointed out it may not be. Yeah? But a natural reaction on the part of all of us is to focus on the here and now. And that's terribly important. But what we also know is that for us to manage effectively and grow and fulfill customer needs in the future, we will have to have an emphasis not only on today's customer, but customers, but future customers. Not only on today's competitors, but future competitors. And this requires us to take time to imagine the future. So here's my third poll question. Relative to your typical pre-crisis schedule, how busy are you? And I'll point out why this is relevant in a second. Sada, please. Are you much less busy, about the same, more busy, much more busy? All right, let's look at the results. You're all over the place. Mostly, actually, all over the place with a less busy and more busy, sort of a split perhaps on it says something about the diversity in our group, which is excellent. My second question is about decision-making within your company. And here's the question: who is the biggest force driving your company's strategic response to the crisis? Sada, could you please put up the question here as well? Is it your CEO or managing director, your chairman, your head of marketing, CMO, head of sales, CFO, chief financial officer, chief technology officer, other, or you don't know? All right, let's take a look at the results. Not surprising, but important point. It is largely a CEO, the person at the top. Most people seem to know who is the biggest force, and in some cases it's other. This is important information we will talk about in a second. So as we think about the future, the extent to which we focus on future customers and future competitors turns out to be fairly significant. My colleagues and I did a study I'll describe in a second on crises and in industries where crises are, or at least bankruptcies and financial distress are common. In this case, technology companies, software and so on, lots of them, and even during non-pandemics at times, a lot of them are born and a lot of them die. And so we looked at the CEOs who, as you pointed out, are most believe and are the primary forces driving change and response to the crisis. We looked at the extent to which these CEOs focus on the medium to long-term future. Ask yourself, how likely is this going to, how large is this going to be? We know in a normal quote unquote world that the number tends to be depressingly low. It's about 3%. The typical CEO, and people have followed CEOs around and coded the amount of time they've focused on the medium to long-term future. The typical CEO spends about 3% focusing on the long-term, a medium to long-term future. Now, of course, this is the individual so many of us look to be the source of the force for change. Now, how do you measure? We've also looked at the language that CEOs use, and many of you are on Zoom calls, among others, with the relevant heads of your companies. I have a task for you for your next time. Yeah? Try to look for the percentage of time that the CEO spends focusing on the medium to long-term future. Is it a large one? Is it a large percent or a small percentage? This will say something in our research we have found. This will say something about the likelihood that your company will get out of the crisis and grow after the crisis. You pointed out, you have time on your hands, many of you, and you think, at least for the immediate term, there are ideas that can be implemented. Too often, though, this is the reality in companies. Here's the leader off to battle. Tell him we haven't got time for any of his bright ideas. We've got a battle on our hands. And of course, the someone in the recesses of the company has already developed something that could have been helpful. How do you avoid that? I want to point to a story about a basketball player. The basketball player is Bill Bradley. Some of you may know him. And Bill Bradley was famous for somehow being able to see what was in front of him, not only see what was in front of him, but his competitors felt he could even see what was behind him. So not only could he anticipate the future by looking at, on the court, by looking at what was in front of him, but he could anticipate the future by also seeing a much wider sense of the court by looking behind him. And a reporter asked him, so Mr. Bradley, they say that you have this ability to look behind you. Is this true? And he says, yes, I can. And my field of vision is much greater, but it didn't come by accident. Every day from the time I was a child, he says, I used to exercise my eye muscles so that I could look to the side, further and further. Over time, I developed a much wider field of vision. He was therefore able to anticipate the future, not only by seeing what was directly in front of him, but by seeing a much broader sense of the court as it was evolving. The question for you is, how good is your peripheral vision? If you're in a large company, or indeed if you've been doing similar things for a long time, the odds are that there are boundaries in our mind. These boundaries tell us what the relevant geography is for us, what the relevant industry is for us, and what the relevant technologies that we should focus on should be. And this creates what I call the uniqueness trap. We say the stuff that's happening in Italy, not very relevant. China, completely different context. We're different, don't you know? But the opportunities for innovation come from concept arbitrage, taking concepts from one place and applying them elsewhere. And that is not, I hope there's one thing that comes through today and in this pandemic, it is that there are opportunities to make a difference, do the things differently by looking far away from our own context, across geographies, across industries, and across technologies. And the genius of innovators and those who make a difference once things are done, once the pandemic subsides, is that they're able to look for places to copy from. Their genius is in editing to their own context and executing, or what I call pasting, to their own context. That is why they're able to identify what is at the end of the tunnel. So let me end by saying, the weeping may last through the night, but there will be joy in the morning. And as we prepare for that morning, we have to think about not only what is happening today, but future customers and future competitors. And the world we emerge into will be different, even if the firms involved don't evolve. And that's the fruitful eye problem. Some will die and the new ones will have new ideas. And the winds of change that we're experiencing today will likely get even stronger. But we are capable of change. We can evolve, especially if you're a large firm, if you have the resources, if you have the cushion. Now is the opportunity. We can shape the future. And so what can leaders do? I point to two things before I end. One is about thinking differently. We have to consciously change the information environment in which we live. The present and the short term will necessarily loom large, and that's important. But peripheral customers and future customers are even more important as we look forward than they will be today. And it should not only be the most influential customers that you focus on. Now is the time, especially since so many of you pointed out you have the time. Stay curious, do your exercises, not only on your exercise bike, but also your mental exercises to look across context, build your peripheral vision. And the winds of change may seem faint now, but will become the gales of tomorrow. So what can you do differently? Of course, you have to reprioritize for growth. And of course, there are difficult decisions to be made around opportunity costs, around costs. We have to conserve cash. But when you make those difficult decisions, remember not only the direct costs, but the opportunity costs you might be giving up. And ensure as much as possible that you have the ability to seek that option and act on that option later on. Maintain, just as we have all been catching up with friends we haven't caught up in a long time, the same applies in companies. Seek and maintain diversity in relationship. You know, the challenge that many senior leaders will face is being cut off not only by sitting at home, but in who talks during those Zoom meetings, whose input they get. And so consciously seeking out diversity among your people is important, and among your customers and competitors. And my last point is about supporting, just as we support the National Health Service and the frontline folks, support the innovators. Because Machiavelli pointed out, for he who innovates will have for his enemies all those who are well off under the existing order of things, and only lukewarm supporters in those who might be better off under the new. And there are some with new ideas, and especially those who are going through formative years today will have ideas, and this event will shape them substantially. We know this from prior crises. So for instance, it turns out the people who came of driving age around the time of the oil crisis in the United States are much less more likely to share driving, less likely to have access to a vehicle or use public transit. What will happen today to those who are coming of age and are going through their formative years now? We know from those who came of age during the Great Depression that those CEOs who came of age during that period, during the Great Depression, remained conservative and avoided risk in how they acted far after they had become CEOs. The events that happened in their childhood made a difference. And it makes a difference whether the activities they engage in yield positive outcomes or negative outcomes. Also, the backgrounds matter. I was struck to see an article about the countries that seem to be succeeding, and there's an element worth exploring further there. And for all of us who are not exactly coming of age, I was struck by this article. Actually, my childhood was quite dull. I tend to look at now as my formative years. You may feel a sense of dissatisfaction these days. I will note that dissatisfaction is the first necessity of progress. Our Queen pointed out, we will be with our friends again, we will be with our families again, and I'm optimistic that we will meet again. And until then, be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rajesh. That was terrific. You covered a lot of ground, and there's of course a lot of questions. So I'm just going to dive in, kind of going back almost to where we started. You asked about changes in customer behavior. You know, one person says, you know, will there be major changes in consumer behavior post-pandemic? Are people going to be more cautious? Will they have a lower risk appetite? I mean, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about what you think might be the nature of the changes in consumer behavior?
Thank you for asking that question, because I didn't get time to delve into that. I'll point out two things. One, inertia is a powerful thing. And that applies to our lives as consumers, as well as to our lives as managers. An effect of the pandemic has been to break us out of our habits. This means that suddenly people who are not buying deliveries a certain way are buying deliveries a certain way. Suddenly we're discovering new possibilities on where we can order food and medicines and various other things. There may be some changes in habits as a result, and some competitors may benefit from it. We're already seeing that in places like China. Importantly though, the greatest effects, and this comes to behaviors around safety and so on, are likely to be, at least based on experience, but based on history, are likely to be among those who are going through their formative years now. And so if as a child, I have experienced, especially firsthand, either the positive effects of being careful, more importantly, the negative effects that happen to someone who's close to me, then those behaviors will last much longer. So it's a nuanced question, and the answer is it depends on the segment.
So people like ourselves, there's a good chance we're going to kind of go back to behavior as usual once we get through this. But our kids' generation, if you like, may be a little bit more susceptible.
Correct, and that there may be spillovers to other things as well. Yeah, and it's not just safety. Correct.
Yeah. Good. So, I mean, a kind of a linked question. This is still in the world of, shall we say, B2C marketing, and we'll get to B2B in a minute. But should a company be limiting its brand awareness campaigns in the short term? And the linked question is, how can we market in this era without seeming like we're somehow profiting from misery and hardship? Yeah. Any thoughts on the types of advertising that we should be doing in this period?
Correct. Yeah, and as the person who asked the question astutely noted, I do not touch on those tactical issues here, but they're very important ones. You all, no doubt, received 1 million emails from every website or company you've ever interacted with, pointing out all of the steps they've taken to remain safe and all of the reasons why they will be, a good business to bank with, to work with, and so on. There's a real. The reality is, we will. That information will be drowned out. Now the question is, how does one differentiate? And this is where one has to be really clear. We're very, very careful. People expect two things at least. One is fairness, broadly defined, and second is trust. Yeah. So there's a movement to safety. So to the extent that you can benefit from that, that's a good thing. The second is with trust in not just your motives, but in your capabilities. Yeah? And people are discovering things to the extent that you can show that you're relevant and you have the capabilities to be of use. That's a good thing. On the point about profiteering, this is a question we have to ask ourselves all the time. Yeah, and if anything, this is a question that hopefully more of us are asking today, which is, how much does what we do really help the world? Right. And to the extent the answer is it does make a difference, we should be very clear about making that point. And if it doesn't, maybe you should be asking yourself, is this what you should be doing?
No, absolutely. Look, I may come back to some more B2C questions, but I want to get on to B2B marketing. One question is essentially, look, an awful lot of business to business marketing is relationships. It's personal contacts, of course, very difficult to build those sort of relationships online. What are your, I guess, higher level thoughts about the way that B2B marketing might change through this period?
Yeah. So in some ways, B2B marketers have a harder time because of the reason you mentioned, which is that so much of it is done through personal relationships. Julian, as Dean of Executive Programs, you know this well. It's hard to replicate the London Business School executive education classroom, although we're trying hard. But in other ways, the B2B marketer has an easier job in that the number of folks who are critical is smaller, and the individuals there are somehow more reachable. And so the same things that apply to the ways in which we're reaching out to our friends and family should apply there. Yeah. Now, the same questions about whether our activities are of relevance and importance to them remains true. Yeah, there are plenty of things people are worried about right now, and to the extent that we could either show expertise, and once again, looking across contexts helps. Yeah? So we are a company that knows not only pick your local market, but also what is happening in China, but also what is happening elsewhere. And we can bring together those relationships. Right. That provides you with a level of expertise about your B2B customer's business that the customer may value much more today than they may have. So it's important not only to maintain those key customer relationships, number one, but also those who are on the periphery and seek out new ones, but also the relationships that customers will value on your behalf.
Got it. Yeah. No, it's a kind of a neat point because we talk a lot about resilience as an attribute of a strong company, and we all understand what financial resilience is about, having a strong balance sheet. We understand supply chain resilience, being able to get products to our customers. You're really kind of helping us to understand what resilience in customer relationships looks like. And of course, resilience in customer relationships is not a CRM database. It's a set of deep relationships that we've got. I mean, sorry, I'm answering your own question for you.
No.
You want to add anything to that?
You're one of the world's experts on resilience, so talk away, Julian. But on that, the important point is resilience should account for, we should all spend more than 3% of time anticipating the future. Yeah? We should all spend time thinking about the periphery, because a lot is changing there. And in order for us to be resilient in the future, we need to have spent time, because otherwise, much like shark attacks, those events will appear unimportant to us, and therefore we will not build resilience, because resilience has to be focused around certain activities. And we will not build resilience because we think, well, who could have ever predicted this would happen?
Right. So there was a question actually, which I want to pick up on, just because it links to the point you made about the so-called availability heuristic, the shark attacks. So how can we as marketers be using this a little bit more smartly to our own benefit, if you see what I mean? You must have given some thought to that issue over the years.
Correct, yes. So recognize right now, the equivalent of the shark in the mind of the consumer is COVID. Yeah. Right. So the original question we discussed earlier, but how do you stay relevant? There has to be a link somehow to the issues that they are concerned about, because that's their information environment. Right? But at some point, the information environment will change. I don't know about you. I've already stopped. I've changed the settings on my digital newspaper subscriptions so that it doesn't keep feeding me just desperate news about COVID. So at some point that will change. And are we prepared once that information environment changes? In fact, are we prepared to help shape the new information environment?
So there were a couple of people, I think 3 or 4 actually, picked up on the peripheral vision point, the Bill Bradley story. I mean, lots of ways of asking this, but are there some systematic approaches at a corporate level for building our peripheral vision? I guess is the best way to ask.
It's an excellent question. It's not only an individual skill. I'm debating whether, many of us, Julian, work with bankers. And banking is going through, even before all this happened, banking was going through a major change. A banker's definition too often, I've noticed, of what it is to have peripheral vision is to look at a bank in a similar European country, for example, if you're a European bank. They bring in folks with technology backgrounds, and that's important. So diversity in the discussion helps change the vision, because we're benefiting from the vision of others. But the question is, to what extent do your important discussions involve things that are not directly in front of you?
Got it.
And some boards, I'm on the board of a listed company, and we have agreed that we will spend time focusing every time we meet as a board. We will spend time talking not just about what's in front of us or what happened last quarter, but looking to the sides. Where should we be? What are the big things that are happening?
Got it. So
you can systematize that. The answer depends in part on the context, but you could systematize that. Yes.
Okay, look, we're running out of time, but I've got time for probably 3 or 4 more questions. Do you expect companies to still have the budget to innovate, or will we be focusing too much on short-term cost savings and hoarding of cash? Any thoughts on that?
Great question. This was actually part of our research on distressed companies that managed to get out of distress. So not only did the companies that managed to get out of distress focus more on the future and focus more on the external environment. Actually, important point, by the way. In that research, we find that the companies that got out of distress not only focused more on the future, but also focused on more on customers and future customers, as well as internal. What they did not focus on as much, at least during that period of crisis, was competitors. Because the competitor situation is changing dramatically. In terms of investments, they did cut costs, but they increased R&D. Now, I know this sounds glib and this sounds like an obvious thing, do your exercise, take your vitamins kind of a thing, but it's actually very important because it is the reason innovative companies that become the giants of tomorrow are born during periods like these is twofold. One, customers have new needs. Customers, there are things in the market that no one currently provides, and someone finds a way. But also, often these things in the market that no one currently provides, the answer to those is created by someone who's within a large company, who has the expertise, the linkages, the customer networks, the broader set of resources to look beyond. And the folly in not investing, in this case, in R&D, or trying to hoard everything, is that we will lose those individuals with the bright ideas. We will lose those ideas themselves because our focus is on doing more of the same. Now, I realize it's not an easy answer, easy thing to do. But this balance, and therefore, I know we had a session with Andrew Lickerman around judgment. The judgment of leaders becomes especially important in periods like these.
So we've had 3 or 4 questions on digital marketing. I mean, obviously, that's a huge topic, but can you address the kind of the big underlying issue, which is, of course, a lot of digital marketing is putting stuff onto digital platforms, automating things, using a number of different middlemen, and allowing our computers and the algorithms inside these to sort of automate big chunks of what we do. Is that going to change as a result of the period we're going through? Will we start to see some of the downsides as well as some of the benefits of automation?
Yeah. I'm not, 2 points. One, what I'm hearing about marketing investments in general is that they've gone down. So how things will be in the future is a tricky one. But digital, people think when they think digital marketing, they simply think, they too often assume that's the same thing as, Twitter and emails and so on. But areas that are already seeing massive growth are customer service, not only the checkout counter example, but customer service through AI in call centers that are overloaded right now. And those skills, just as the Y2K problem that some of you may remember, I won't get into, led to the growth of the massive growth of the Indian outsourcing companies. That was the origin, remember. Yeah? This will lead to the growth of companies we don't know yet.
Yeah.
So I would define digital marketing more broadly in being able to connect more generally. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, a CEO of a company in India, perhaps he's on right now. He has a council of villagers because he's cut off and his work is in remote India. He has a council of villagers who are providing, who are on Microsoft Teams on their smartphones, and are providing, unfiltered insights about what is really happening in villages that he simply cannot get physically today. Yeah, and that's digital, and that's an insight on customer behavior that we should not omit in our focus on just marketing in the sense of sending out a bunch of emails.
Yeah, and those of us in the world of education, we're learning to teach online, and we're discovering that actually, in some ways, teaching through Zoom with the chat function open has some benefits over teaching face-to-face. So occasionally you do see these big new opportunities.
I know, Julian, you've been trying to tell us that much before the pandemic happened. Well, we're finally starting to get it.
Finally getting the message across. Look, we must finish there. Thank you so much, Rajesh. Before we go, could I just pull up the slide which tells you a little bit about what's next? We've got a website there, obviously, london.edu/pandemic webinars. You can find the recordings of all the past 10 webinars and information about the next ones that are coming up. I should just also note that if you go to the london.edu website, you will find information about all of our online courses and indeed the face-to-face ones, which will be coming up in the next few months. Probably September will be the first time we're offering face-to-face programs again. And looking forward now to the next webinar, which is on Tuesday next week. That is my colleagues Dominic Holder and Jules Goddard. And they're going to be talking about the upside of pestilence, how the virus will humanize our organizations. So they've written a book on this subject, and they're going to be sharing some fairly deep thoughts about what this potentially means for us as individuals in terms of how we live our lives and how we work within our organizations. So with that, I will close. Thank you once again to Rajesh for a fascinating talk. Thank you, the audience, for listening. And I will look forward to seeing you all again this time on Tuesday next week. Thank you.